Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because even with all of the drama this week surrounding the quantum computing breakthrough, the Microsoft shareholders rejecting the proposal to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and the leverage washout we saw in altcoins, the Bitcoin base case remains unchanged. As long as Bitcoin continues to close weekly candles above 100,000, our base case has to be that Bitcoin will continue to grind higher. Now, if we were to see a weekly close below that level, we could start to entertain the idea of a lot more sideways price action and chop, or even a larger pullback perhaps. But based on current weekly market structure, it looks like Bitcoin wants to grind higher over the next few weeks. This is why I was able to remain confident in the weekly report I published on Monday, saying I wasn't surprised that we started the week off with a little bit of chop to shake out over leveraged traders before our next move higher. And that's because we talked about how altcoin open interest was almost double the open interest in Bitcoin. And historically, that much leverage in altcoins has resulted in those quick and painful leverage washouts like what we saw in March of 2024 or July of 2024. And that ended up being exactly what we saw on Monday, where we saw the largest liquidation event since 2021 that wiped out almost $1.6 billion. Last week, we talked about how the December 5th liquidation event was larger than the one we had in August 5th earlier this year, even though the price move was a lot smaller. And then this week's liquidation event was almost double the one we saw last week in size, even though Bitcoin only went down about 5%, which really gives you an idea of how much leverage there was in this market, especially in the altcoins. We saw a healthy sentiment reset with the fear and greed falling as low to about 75, I believe, but it has seen a bounce recently, kind of similar to what we saw in March 2024, where we dipped into the greed region and then bounced back into the extreme greed. Not sure if that's exactly how it's going to play out again, but that's why I named my weekly report Fearful When Others Are Greedy, because usually when you spend too long in the extreme greed region, it's only a matter of time before you see a shakeout or a leverage wipe. And these events are always accompanied by a narrative, whether it's China banning Bitcoin or Elon turning his back on Bitcoin like he did in 2021, saying it was bad for the environment. And this time it was Google unveiling a breakthrough in quantum computing that now everybody is pointing the finger at for that quick shakeout. And this is bringing up the question of whether this is going to threaten Satoshi Nakamoto's 1 million Bitcoin. Is this going to break the encryption used for cryptocurrencies? And maybe we'll have to worry about this one day, but this is at least a few years out in my opinion. And I'm quite confident that algorithms are going to be updated to fight against these new quantum computing breakthroughs before they become an issue. The other negative narrative that investors were pointing the finger at was the Microsoft shareholders voting no for the Bitcoin reserve proposal. This really shouldn't surprise anyone. I know the permables on Twitter were bull posting this, acting like it was guaranteed and Microsoft would be dumb not to do this. But why would Microsoft complicate their business model and distract their shareholders and investors by adding the volatility and variability of Bitcoin to their balance sheet when they run what is essentially the best business and money printer in the world? So why complicate that by adding Bitcoin? So it does not surprise me whatsoever that they voted against that complication. Maybe 1 year way down in the future when Bitcoin is less volatile and more established, bigger companies like Microsoft or Apple or Amazon could entertain something like this. But as of right now, it makes no sense whatsoever for them to take on that volatility. So I'm not surprised they voted against it. And this is why I put so much more value on price action compared to narratives and investor sentiment, because the price action captures all the narratives, all the buyers and sellers, all of the emotions experienced by the market in one simple price chart. So as long as we're breaking above resistance levels, I have to expect further upside, no matter what the narrative at the time is. But if we were to show weakness by falling back into the range and closing below 100,000, I would ignore whatever the narrative is at the time and start to be a little bit more concerned in the short term that we're going to enter some sideways chop or perhaps a downtrend. And there are so many reasons why I am optimistic that Bitcoin can still rally higher, even with the $2.9 billion in liquidations we've seen so far in December. The options market, which I tend to consider to be a little bit more smart money, is still pricing 111,000 per Bitcoin by February. We're still seeing very strong and very consistent ETF inflows day after day and week after week, no matter what the Bitcoin price does. We're seeing Bitcoin open interest now in line with price, which tells us there's a lot of healthy demand for Bitcoin right now from institutional investors. MicroStrategy continues to buy Bitcoin no matter what the price, and there's a lot of excitement that perhaps tomorrow the Nasdaq 100 will announce that MicroStrategy is being added to the index, which would allow more passive buying of the stock. Bitcoin miners like Mara and Riot continue to buy hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin and have no plans to sell the Bitcoin that they are getting from mining. And we're seeing a lot of famous investors talking about the debt issue and talking about fiat currency debasement and the bull thesis for Bitcoin and gold. So a lot of these optimistic narratives and catalysts, as well as price action, just further increase my conviction that we still have higher to go before the eventual cycle top. I would like nothing more than to see price rally all the way through 2025. That just isn't my base case as of right now, because we're still seeing a lot of profit taking from long-term holders. Now that Bitcoin is trading around 100,000, a lot of holders are sitting on life-changing money, and the longer it spends at these prices, the more tempted they are to start taking some chips off of the table and lock in some of those lifestyle improvements. But these large spikes in long-term holder profit taking don't have to be cycle tops. They can be local tops like what we saw in March and like we saw in January of 2021 before we had a pullback and rallied quite a bit higher. And I know a lot of people don't like the long-term holder metric because it counts anyone that's held Bitcoin over 6 months. That's why I like to look at this coin days destroyed metric, which accounts for how many days it's been since that Bitcoin last moved. So instead of bundling all the long-term holders into one category as any investor that hasn't moved the Bitcoin in over 6 months, this one directly incorporates how many days it's been since that Bitcoin value had moved previously. So it puts a lot more emphasis on Bitcoin that hasn't moved in 5 years or 7 years or 10 years compared to Bitcoin that hasn't moved in 6 months or 7 months. And as you can see, this metric is spiking quite a bit as well. Again, it doesn't mean we have to have a cycle top today or tomorrow, but it does mean that we are towards the end game where we probably have a couple of months left, maybe 3 to 4 months of rallying, like what we saw towards the end of 2017, like what we saw towards the middle half of 2021. And this is something I'll continue to monitor as we move forward. But if we continue to see an acceleration in long-term holder profit taking, I have to keep an eye on this short cycle scenario. As for my portfolio, no changes made this week. Still quite happy with my holdings. I go into more detail on the weekly report because I don't want to make this channel too much about my portfolio specifically, just more focused on what I'm monitoring in the market in general. But as long as my cash is between 20 to 30%, I'm happy to ride out the rest of my holdings as we go forward. Still great performance from Solana, Bitcoin, and Ethereum this year. I still have high hopes that maybe Ethereum can play some catch up. After struggling for so long, the chart for Ethereum looks absolutely incredible. We have been rejected by this 4K resistance level 4 times previously. And you can see that even with the rejection we saw with the liquidation event earlier this week, price has immediately bought Ethereum back up. And I think it's only a matter of time before Ethereum breaks out above 4,000. And it's nice to see the Ethereum spot ETF inflows remaining consistent as well as we see capital start to rotate from Bitcoin to Ethereum. And I'm quite confident we're going to be seeing a lot of these cryptocurrency index ETFs launching over the next few months, which allow investors to position in both Bitcoin and Ethereum via just one ETF. And perhaps it'll be weighted by market cap. And I think this is a great narrative for Ethereum to get even more flows going forward. As for Solana, still not doing much, came down and retested our previous range high on that liquidation event and got a nice bounce off of that level. Again, anything in this range is just consolidation in my opinion before Solana breaks higher, but I don't see any signs of worry as of right now. especially as long as we're closing above $200. So we'll see where Bitcoin closes this weekly candle. I would love to see another close above 100K for even more conviction that we're going to go higher in the short term, but I will change my tune if we see a close below 100K this week. As for macro, we still have global liquidity going down, and we really want to see this reverse sometime soon because we know Bitcoin has been following global liquidity with a 2 to 3 month lag, which means that Bitcoin could top out sometime late December, early January if we don't see a reversal in global liquidity sometime soon. And of course, that's going to be driven by what we end up seeing from the US dollar index. Is this a lower high that's going to send it a lot lower, or is this just some consolidation before it breaks higher? A lot of that is going to rely heavily on what we hear from the Fed in the upcoming FOMC meeting on December 18th. A rate cut is all but locked in right now with a 98% probability. But what I'll be paying attention to is the economic projections that we're going to receive, where the Fed is going to tell us their forecast for 2025 for the Fed interest rate, the unemployment rate, and what they're anticipating for inflation, because as of right now, the market is only pricing in 3 rate cuts over the next 12 months, but perhaps the Fed can tell us something different in their economic projections now that we're seeing this increasing weakness in the labor market, and inflation is still quite low compared to where it's been over the past 2 years. I don't think the market will care too much about inflation until we see a CPI or a core CPI above 4%. As for traditional markets, the S&P 500 continues its uptrend, which is the exact backdrop we want to see for Bitcoin if Bitcoin is going to continue rallying over the next few months. And a lot of that is driven by the huge federal deficits being run by the government. We are now at $624 billion 2 months into the fiscal year of 2025, which is 64% above what we were at the same time last year in the fiscal year of 2024. And I expect that deficit trend to only worsen in the short term. And if I'm expecting more debt issuance from federal governments, that means that debt has to get monetized eventually, which will continue to devalue the fiat currency. So I remain bullish risk assets like the S&P 500 and Bitcoin over the next few months as that trend continues. But anyway, let me know what you think Bitcoin does next. Is the most likely scenario Bitcoin grinding higher or a decent sized pullback? Would love to know what you expect. As always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.